You're listening to the Security Matters podcast. I'm David Puner, a senior editorial manager at CyberArk, the global leader in identity security. Imagine this. You're defending your company from a cyber attack. But this isn't the stereotype of a lone attacker in a hoodie. We've all seen that cliche enough. The group coming after you has an org chart. They run sprints, they track ROI, and when they pull off a breach, they celebrate with a pizza party, just like any other successful business hitting its goals. Now they've decided you're their next project. This may sound like the opening to a cybersecurity thriller, but it's real. Today's guest, Ian Schneller, has seen it firsthand. As a former CISO, most recently with Healthcare Service Corporation, HCSC, and a U.S. Air Force veteran, Ian joins us to break down what it takes to stay ahead of today's most organized and rapidly evolving threat actors. From building resilience against fast-moving attacks to strengthening identity defenses and applying mission-driven leadership, Ian shares practical strategies and stories drawn from the cockpit, the command center, and the boardroom that security leaders can use to help stay ahead of evolving threats. Let's get into it with Ian Schneller. Ian Schneller, welcome to Security Matters. Thanks so much for coming on to the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. My first time, too. Very excited.
Well, really appreciate having you on. Where does this podcast find you today?
In Dallas, Texas, in the middle of summer. Very hot.
All right. So we're air conditioned today, I imagine.
We are.
I'm actually not running AC. I'm in New Hampshire today, and it's like high 60s, which is kind of odd after being in the 90s all week in Boston.
You're making me jealous. Maybe next time I go to New Hampshire, and I called it New Hampshire. That's what my kids called New Hampshire when they were younger.
The live free or die state. And today it is cloudy and raining and cold. So there you have it. Anyway, let's dive right in. There's a lot we got to talk about here, a lot we want to talk about. You've had a remarkable career spanning roles in the U.S. Air Force, cybersecurity leadership at major financial institutions, and most recently as CISO at HCSC, otherwise known as Healthcare Service Corporation. What initially drew you to cybersecurity, and how has your perspective on the field evolved over the years?
Oh, it's a great question, and I'm going to start with a story.
Okay.
And you'll see there's a theme here. I have stories, right? It helps me in my brain kind of resonate.
Perfect.
About 5 months ago, 20 CISOs in Dallas, we met and had dinner. We started out with, how did you get into cybersecurity? We had somebody who was a rodeo rider, a dancer, a ballerina, a musician, a fighter pilot, that wasn't me, and a whole gamut of really interesting jobs. And the really interesting part with all is nobody started out in cybersecurity. About maybe half didn't have a technical background to start, and life pushed them into the cybersecurity route. And so I was kind of a hybrid. I had a technical background, but I didn't join or start my career thinking I was going to be a cybersecurity expert. I had a technical degree, but I also had a pilot's license. I flew aerobatics. I flew high-performance aircraft. I was going to be a pilot in the Air Force. That was my plan. And as many of us know, life might have plans for you that aren't your plans. And long story short, just summarizing briefly, is right after the first Gulf War budget cutbacks, after being at a fighter pilot squadron for a while to just kind of get my legs under me before going to formal training, the Air Force said, we don't need as many pilots, but you have a technical degree. How about you go be an intelligence officer?
All right.
Like, okay. I don't know what that is, but I'll find out. And I did that for a couple of years. And then there was a call for a very specialized workforce for what eventually turned into offensive cyber, and did that through the nation's intel community for a long time. It was about 15 years ago when the Air Force said, how about we take what you learned as an offensive cyber individual and put that into defense. And they assigned me to be a CIO and a CISO. I was dual-hatted into a joint role at an Air Force base in Northern California. And so it took about 15, 20 years of my career to actually get into a true defensive role.
And overall, you spent about 24, 25 years in the U.S. Air Force?
24 years in uniform.
And in the cyber realm, how long were you with the Air Force?
I would have to kind of count it out. If you count the offensive and the defensive side, all told, probably 12, probably closer to 15.
Okay. So then what was it like to shift over from military to corporate cybersecurity? Were there any particular lessons from your time at Cyber Command or the NSA that really struck with you in the private sector?
First of all, say, as a veteran, as a senior officer, very comfortable to the degree you can be in a very large organization called the Department of Defense, you're all of a sudden vulnerable. You're in the private sector, different language, different culture, different business, different people, different lessons learned. It can be a tough transition. And I think it would probably be tough in many ways for many veterans. And so as an ask for anybody who's hiring a veteran, realize it can be tough, and having some mentoring along the way goes a long ways in developing that person. You feel vulnerable for a while. And so it was with me. I had to learn finance. I spent hours and hours every night reading books on how does the nation's economy work? How do banks work? What are banking laws, banking regulations? I studied really hard on that. And it was a lot of work. I enjoyed it. I loved it. But that meant it was a while before I could really, truly be effective in understanding the business model of what I'm here to support. So that's a general advice I would give anybody in the career, is spend time to learn how your business works, whatever it is. And then, of course, when I became the CISO at HCSC, I had to spend a lot of time learning how the healthcare sector works.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because across your career, you've overseen massive cyber defense operations in critical industries like finance and healthcare. How did those sectors differ in their approach to cybersecurity challenges, and what strategies proved universally effective?
It's a great question, and one that I get asked a lot. And so this is my opinion from observations across defense sector and healthcare sector and finance. Is part of it's just the baseline of how it's formed. And if you look at how an industry baseline is formed, it usually starts from laws and regulations. And the sectors have different laws, rules, regulations. Healthcare sector is underpinned by HIPAA and high tech. Very important. How old is that? When was the last time the information security portions were updated? Around 20 years ago, a little bit over.
Okay.
And so the threat has changed a lot in 20 years. For organizations who have aligned their security program to that specific rule regulation, but not evolved, they're about 20 years behind the cyber threats. My personal opinion is that's one of the reasons factoring into some of the breaches that you see. One of the other things, if you look, and very noble, it's right, HIPAA high tech is aligned to protect private health information for citizens. It's great. But it doesn't really get into ensuring the availability of services. A major breach can occur that doesn't affect the information, but can affect an individual's ability to access care. And we've seen that in some really very, very large news stories over the last year or two. Mm-hmm. And so when you put the two of those together, I see in the healthcare sector, and it's getting better, thankfully, but over the last few years, many organizations have aligned around saying, I'm compliant with HIPAA high tech, I'm done. And they don't evolve into staying in front of the threat, the adversary. And that's probably the biggest thing that I see.
You mentioned that you started out as a pilot. First of all, are you still flying? And second of all, how is being a CISO in some ways similar to being a pilot, or is it not?
One, and I have to be fully disclosed, the last time I flew a plane as pilot in command was in 1999. It's been a long time.
Okay.
If you and I went flying, you'd probably be scared and I'd spill your coffee. So you don't want me flying right now. It's been a while.
Uh-huh.
But there's so many things. There's so many parallels between so many different careers. I think in general, it's a beautiful question to ask anyone. Here's a few things, and we could make this an entire day-long conversation on the parallels. The first thing is metrics. And I've given a presentation to a sector conference on metrics. As a pilot, you're trained to know the key risk indicators for your system. What's going to cause a problem? What do you do about it? And in information security, we love metrics. We can generate metrics all day long. but which ones matter? What do you do about it when it goes out of tolerance? What's your tolerance, right? And there's so many more things we could talk about metrics, but being trained in what really matters and how do you keep your system operating safely is almost an exact parallel. But here's the interesting thing, and I'm just going to give you just a taste because we maybe should talk about this another time. But what happens when there's an incident in the aviation community? Deep investigation, and the entire world finds out every single thing that went wrong leading up to that accident. And then it's published. And then everybody learns from it so that you don't repeat the same mistake. What happens in the information security world? You don't find out. You hear a generic statement, oh, a company got breached, and it was because they didn't follow good practices. Well, what specifically? So I think we have a lot we could learn from the aviation industry.
Really interesting. I'm glad we touched upon that. And yes, I would be fascinated to have a day-long conversation with you about it. So then getting back to being a CISO, you've been a CISO in some pretty intense environments. What's typically misunderstood about the CISO role, and how do you personally define success in it?
Well, the CISO role, like many executive positions, I don't want to say that we're different in this aspect, but it is stressful. One thing I see that is a little bit different in the CISO role is consider an organization that, for example, misses earnings targets. What does the news report usually say? It usually says company X missed targets and so on and so forth. What happens if a company gets breached? In that case, company got breached and the CISO, and they name the person and it's their fault. It becomes personal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to me, very different environment. The other one I would say that's very different in this role, in any business role, you could call it warfare in a way that, you've got threats and they're trying to disrupt your model. But in cybersecurity, those threats at the end of the day are people, and they've picked you and they're actively targeting you and your team. And so it becomes more personal and it becomes a little bit more like what you might consider warfare. And I think that's why you see the term cyber warfare a lot. It is truly warfare. There are people out there trying to do you harm, and de facto, your customers.
Then speaking of cyber warfare, the growing sophistication of cyber adversaries, attackers, bad actors, whatever you might call them, have you seen them evolve firsthand, particularly their use of zero-day vulnerabilities in global operations?
There are many terms. To me, the clinically correct term is threat actor.
Okay.
It's a little clinical. They're hackers. They're bad guys, probably bad gals. You get the idea. Well, I call them threat actors usually. And to understand the answer to that question, first of all, I think it's really important to understand who are they and what motivates them. And depending on what you look at, it might be a nation state motivated by intelligence purposes. It might be a criminal motivated by money. It might be a hacktivist motivated about standing behind a position. By and large, what we see and hear in a lot of the media are criminals. But what I'm going to say next really applies to any threat actor. They're getting better. Look at their techniques. To me, it's extremely interesting to go a double click down behind what we're seeing. What have we seen over the last 12, 18 months? A wealth of zero-day vulnerabilities discovered in what I call edge devices, firewalls, proxies, endpoint devices that gain initial access into a network. And what I don't think coverage has gone deep enough onto is understanding how does that happen? The threat actors have to invest in research and defense. So when you pay that ransom, some of that money is going into investing in new capabilities. What does that mean? How do you get the technology into the country you're operating from? How do you reverse engineer that to find the vulnerability? This is really tough work. And then what's really interesting, and you can look at a couple of examples over the last year, 2 years. Now they've weaponized it globally at scale. Think of a few things that happened with 0 days that we found out about after. And part of the aftermath wasn't just the 0 day, but many, many companies were breached over the weekend. Think how hard that is to do that and to weaponize it, to deploy it, to execute, collect the information rapidly in a period of days. This is really sophisticated work. And so when I put that back together, They're getting better. They will always get better because those motivations I mentioned at the beginning will not change. They'll always want money or more intelligence or to make a public stand for or against something. And so whatever today's state of capabilities are, they're going to get better. And whatever we defend against today, we can't forget that that's going to be old news before long. Something else is going to come. And part of our job is to anticipate and forecast what is next and raise the defenses before the threat actors get there. That's a tough job.
So how do you do that? How do you stay atop of it? And how do you anticipate what's coming next?
Well, part of it is red teaming. And yes, we're thinking red teaming, penetration testing, absolutely. But part of it's red teaming to continuously think out of the box. How would I break into my systems? How would I affect my organization? And to have really creative and critical minded individuals work at that constantly. Part of this is experience, just having been, example on one side, on the offensive side, where you have to continuously get better, having that adversary's mindset. And what I like to tell everybody is don't forget the adversary has 51% of the vote and what offensive cyber actions come at your organization. And so you have to consider their motivations, their capabilities in your equation on defense.
How do you mean 51% of the vote?
No matter what you do, the threat actor is going to do what they're going to do, and they're not going to ask you. They're going to do it.
Okay, I see. And you've described threat actors as being as organized as Fortune 500 companies, sometimes even throwing pizza parties after big attacks. What does that level of sophistication mean for how we defend against them?
First of all, don't underestimate the threat actor, the adversary. They're not necessarily a couple of loose net, teenagers in the basement of their mom's house, as kind of a stereotype.
Right.
They might be very well organized. They have profit and loss statements. They invest in research and development. And what's interesting is they very likely have return on investment. If they're going to go after a company at a certain amount of time, it's not worth their time anymore. They might go somewhere else. And so they operate like a financial organization. They are out there to make a profit. And now I'm largely talking criminal actors, right? If it's a nation state after intelligence, different motivation. But again, we know nation states are going to be very well organized. If I were to say, let's boil this down into one piece, is don't underestimate that threat actor. They're very capable.
So then moving to identity, with identity emerging as the new perimeter in cybersecurity, what's your perspective on securing both human and machine identities?
Oh, there's so much we could unwind there. First of all, let's take a macro look at what's happening here. We have vulnerabilities, whatever it is. Maybe it's phishing, who knows? And as the world rallies around reducing that vulnerability, the threat actors will find something different. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of violation of identity vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. And it could be calling a help desk, social engineering your way in. At the end of the day, we've got a person. They want to help you. They're going to capitalize on that. That's the human side. So we're seeing a lot of vulnerabilities in identities. And it's a tough problem to tackle because usually you've got years of maybe practices that need a little bit of hygiene. But then what's coming up is what I call non-person identities, or I think you called it non-human identities.
Machine identities, yeah.
And those are identities that keep applications working. And without going into a lot of details, usually an application needs to talk to another application, and they authenticate with a non-human identity. Mm-hmm. And they might have been there for 15, 20 years. You may not even know all your applications that use it. It's probably a hard-coded password somewhere. These are things that are really tough to discover and fix. That means it's a vulnerability, and threat actors are starting to look into that and exploit it. And that is an avenue into a network.
So then cloud environments continue to present unique challenges. What kinds of risks have you seen with cloud default configurations, and how can organizations stay ahead of them?
Again, I love drawing parallels. And to me, especially, in the early days and to a certain degree now, and not just cloud, I look at it as you bought a car and you it might be your cloud environment. You got this nice, bright, shiny car and you look inside and there's no seatbelt. And you say, well, I want to be safe when I drive my car. Where's my seatbelt? Oh, well, we've got another team And, we can give you a seatbelt, but you're going to have to hire a resident security engineer and budget a year, and we'll put a seatbelt in there for you. But hey, nice car, start driving it now. It's almost the same thing in security. And I think cloud was a big piece, right? When you look at some of the insecure default configurations, other technology is just as guilty. And so to me, I have seen this in a positive trend. I don't think it's at the end of the trend where things are starting to become more secure by default. And that's one big thing we need to get into. It's a very complicated system and there are many configurations. And you can't expect everybody to know all the configurations on day one. So part of it is secure by default is a key trend that we need to aim for and get to.
While we're along the challenges track here, I might as well just keep them coming. Healthcare organizations face mounting pressures from ransomware, legacy infrastructure, and compliance requirements. How should CISOs in the healthcare sector prioritize addressing these intersecting risks?
Hopefully, not all three are insufficient because that's a tough challenge.
Uh-huh.
And I hate to give this answer, but you got to do all three. And I'll unwind that a little bit. If you don't have bare bones compliance met, here's what's going to happen. Internal audit, external audit, regulators are going to drive your strategy. You must do what they say. And so that will be the ones driving your strategy. And you don't want that. You want to drive your own strategy. So get a firm foundation where compliance is solid. But you have to understand that that's not the end of the game. You have to move into the threat actors constantly evolving. We talked about it. How do you stay in front of them? You have to uplift that game all the time. But also what I call operational excellence. Are you deploying the capability across your entire attack surface and correctly? That's tougher than it sounds. And so you must continuously do both. Now, the ransomware piece is really interesting, and we didn't talk too much about it. And one of the ways I've seen CISO roles change is success is and should be don't get hacked.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do, make sure we can respond appropriately and recover back to normal operations quickly so that the business can run. And that's another piece I've seen in the job jar of CISOs. And I think it's a very appropriate one because you've seen it despite your best intentions, maybe a malicious insider. Who knows? You might get breached. You might have your services stop working. Be resilient. Become operational again very quickly.
In your CISO roles, how much of your bandwidth on average was spent combating malicious insiders or preventing malicious insiders or whatever the proper terminology may be?
I don't want to speak specific to a particular role because we could tie it to maybe some things that did or didn't happen. I think the bigger message is I mentioned threat actors, nation states, criminals, hacktivists. There's a fourth class, insider threats. Insider threat could be non-malicious. The person who just fell for the fish and started a chain of events. That could be a non-malicious insider threat.
Right.
Or you could have a malicious insider threat, somebody on purpose exfiltrating information or deploying ransomware. We cannot discount those threats. And so part of a program should have an insider threat capability and detect these risk scenarios that I just mentioned and many more. It is a critical capability, and it is something that I think needs to happen. What I see some organizations say is, oh, our workforce is great, not us. It could be anywhere. And you read the news stories, the media, there's plenty of stories where a malicious insider caused some kind of incident.
Devoted listeners of this podcast may be surprised that we haven't even mentioned artificial intelligence yet in this episode. So let's mention it now. Artificial intelligence and agentic AI is rapidly transforming attack and defense strategies, both sides of the battlefield, if you will. How do you see it being weaponized, and how can defenders use it to their advantage?
It's a great question. It's one I get all the time. And the way I see threat actors using AI, phish messages are really good. Business email compromise messages are really good. Deepfake videos, they're really good. And if you look behind the scenes, really, they're all aimed at getting access to your computer systems or to your money directly. And then also I've seen malware strains that most likely were written by artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And the undiscovered malware or signatures that aren't known, where your tooling can't detect or block against it, is on the increase. So yes, threat actors are using artificial intelligence. The turnaround to that is, if used correctly, it can be a great defensive capability too. Think of a large organization and imagine all the things that happen day in, day out: alerts, warnings, breaches, hopefully none, but there could be. And there's not enough people in the world to look at and analyze all of that. And so artificial intelligence is getting quite good, in my opinion, ways to go, but really impressive, especially compared to a few years ago, with correlating all of that and really dialing down into where might a real problem be? Where might we need to put human attention? It helps us make sure we use our resources appropriately in defense, prioritize defense. And that's for cybersecurity. Now, there are many different risks here, and it's much bigger than the CISO. You know, it really needs to be an enterprise program like AI security. How do we make sure we get the right answers?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make sure it's not hallucinating? How do we make sure it's responsible and ethical? And I think the CISO should be at the table in helping formulate the right answers here, but it shouldn't be only the CISO at that table. It's a very enterprise-wide problem to solve.
And that table, of course, is reflective of the CISO and where the CISO sits at that table. So early in your career, you saw firsthand how technical language can fall flat in business settings. What helped you realize the importance of translating cybersecurity into business outcomes, and how has that shaped your leadership style?
It makes me laugh. I'm telling a story that happened about 30 years ago, and it is still so fresh in my mind. And recall when I first started the Air Force, I was in a fighter pilot squadron. I got to fly a lot of planes, learn a lot. I didn't know anything about cybersecurity, but what the wing commander would do, the wing commander is the boss of the whole base. And about once a month, he would have a big staff meeting of all the different leaders on the base, and he'd let the lieutenant sit against the wall. As long as you didn't talk or move, you were allowed to be in there and listen. And so I was a wallflower and I listened. And I still remember this one day. The equivalent of the base CIO and CISO, they didn't call it that at the time, but the equivalent, he stood up and said, "Hey, boss, I need $1 million, blinky lights, wires, firewall, ones and zeros." And I had an engineering degree, and I didn't even know what this guy was saying. I had no idea. And I had more of an idea than probably the boss at the end of the table who flew fighter jets, but didn't understand information security. And I still remember the guy's look on his face. He was just like stone faced. He had no idea what was being said. He said, "Denied, sit down," just like that. And I remember feeling terrible for this guy. I mean, I still remember. I still feel it right here when I tell you the story.
It sounds like Maverick requesting the flyby right there. Denied.
pretty much, yeah. Almost the same, yeah. And the next month, the same guy comes up, says, "Hey, boss, need $1 million for a firewall. But here's the reason. Here's what this is going to do. On your base, you have about 3 days worth of gas to keep your jets flying. That gas is supplied by an electronic connection that, if disrupted, would stop the flow of gas. For $1 million, we can protect that and ensure you have a steady flow of gas to keep your planes flying as long as you need." Same conversation, same ask, right? But now he changed it to resonate with the leadership at the table. The conversation took as long as I just took right here. And the boss said, "Oh, approved." You see the difference?
Yeah, right.
And so skip forward from that time, it was almost 15 years, maybe a little bit longer, when I took command of the communication squadron, which is the CIO and CISO organization on an Air Force base. And I remember after the ceremony, I walked in and I sat in my chair and I looked and said, "I've never been a CIO. I've never even worked in a CIO or a CISO organization. What am I doing?" Right? And I remembered that story. And so I got story number 2 now. That day was a Friday. I still remember this. And at the end of the day, there was a social. The wing commander hosted a social for all the commanders. And it was about 5:00 on a Friday. This was Northern California. One of my roles, I had all the aircraft systems for that section of Northern California as well, radars and instrument landing systems and all that kind of thing. And I got a call from the crew saying the instrument landing system was out, but don't worry, they'll fix it on Monday. I said, "We should fix it now. Why aren't you going to fix it now?" They said, well, no, our SOP says if it's the weekend, we fix it the next workday. I said, no, you're going to fix it now, tonight. And they got a little upset with me, but they did it. And I said, well, let me explain to you why. And this is where the aircraft experience came in. And I've got to give a little bit of a side to my story. This is 10, 15 years ago. There was a full motion simulator for a big jet on base, like one of the biggest planes in the country. And I was able to get in, and I gave them all lessons on how to fly a radar approach and an instrument landing approach. And the gist of it is you're very precise with an instrument landing approach. You get kind of close with a radar approach. Even though they weren't pilots, they immediately saw once I showed them. And you know what? For the rest of my tenure there, and this was Northern California, lots of fog, think San Francisco. Water just kind of seeps into these things, and there's sometimes glitches. Never once did I have a single complaint. Anytime that instrument landing system had even a potential of a glitch, they're on it. They fixed it immediately, no matter what. And the key here is we turned the business objective into, in this case, an information security priority, the availability of the system. And so if you understand the business you support, it helps you make prioritized decisions. I could go on with stories all day long on this kind of thing. But the key is, as a CISO, understand your business. Understand what generates revenue, what keeps customers happy, what's on the mind of the CEO, COO, and that will really help you prioritize what to fix, what to secure.
Along those lines, what qualities or skills do you believe are the most critical for the next generation of cybersecurity leaders?
Oh, I love the question. I get this asked all the time. So I know you want me to say technology, number one. It's not. It's lower on the list. And so I always say, be a student of leadership. In a lot of my CISO roles, I had hundreds of people in my team. You need to be a leader. You need to understand how to lead teams. And am I saying I'm a perfect leader? No way. But the key is to continuously study, train, and assess, and then adjust and become even better. Be a student of leadership. Be a great communicator. And we talked about some of the techniques here already. Be able to concisely, crisply speak or write your point. Mm-hmm. How many times have you received an email where somebody's asking you for something and it's 3 pages long? I stopped reading after about the 4th sentence. If you can't ask, I'm not going to read it. I don't have time. And so being crisp and clear in communications is really key. Be inquisitive, question, want to understand, be thoughtful in your thinking, and then be able to be decisive and execute. And you know what? Oh, before I get to technology, this is a big one. Know how budgets work. How do we get money? How do we spend money? How do we ask for more money? It sounds trivial, but you know what? That's what makes your program work. Do you have the resources to do your job? You know what? After that, how do you hire people? How do you get more people? And then technology. Obviously, you need to have some kind of technology background. You may not need to be a reverse engineer, but you do need to understand how the technology can be used to help protect against cyber threats.
So then, having worked closely with public-private partnerships, what role do you believe these collaborations play in addressing the cyber challenges of today and tomorrow?
I think public-private partnerships are a great idea. I've seen them strengthen over the last 10 years. I see room to go. Several areas. One, and you're seeing a trend here, right? You gravitate towards what you learned first and what you know. So if you're in a fighter jet flying in enemy territory, you have a radar, and it's picking up threat signals within the view of that radar. But you only see what your system sees. Now imagine if there's many jets out in that battle space, and each one sees part of the picture. What if we can combine that into one picture of the whole battle space? Public-private partnerships can do this with cyber. At the end of the day, you might be working in one organization. You might have a great view of the threat picture that you face, but it might not be complete. And if we can find a way to legally and safely build what we all see into one large threat picture, we can be a better defender. I see public-private partnerships moving there. Another key piece, and this is, to me, overlooked still. We can see instances of this where we just started to pick at this thread, but I call it systemic risk. We are so focused on defending our organization that we may not understand how our organization fits in the ecosystem of healthcare or finance, for example. And what are the key nodes that will make our entire system fall down? Maybe an upstream node organization, utility, for example, might be breached and fail. The trickle-down effects might affect me, and those trickle-down effects might affect 4 other organizations. Pretty soon we have a sector in crisis. It comes down to, how does our sector work? How do we collaborate together to ensure our sector is resilient? And there's work being done there. I think there's a lot more work that can be done. So these are some examples in the public-private partnership.
What threats should CISOs be watching over the next few years? And is there anything flying under the radar that deserves more attention?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's one I think about all the time. And it would be just a great conversation to have, because I know what I'm going to say here isn't going to be the most complete answer. Because here's why. If you go back 10, 15 years ago, nobody envisioned a lot of the threats that we see now.
Right.
And so the key is understanding that they will evolve. There will be new threats. And that's where it starts, with that mentality, that philosophy.
Expecting the unexpected.
Exactly, right? But the motivations probably won't change that much. What did I say? Money, intelligence, public stance. Those probably won't change too much. So if you start there and then critically think about what might happen next. So an example, multi-factor authentication is great. But you know what happens as it starts to become quite deployed large scale? They find ways to work around it. So whatever key defense we have in place now, the threat actor will find some way to work around it. Now, that's one piece. I think insider threats will increase. I hear and I know that quantum technology or quantum safe algorithms will be big.
Yeah.
Quantum computing will really change how defenders need to defend and how attackers are going to attack. Is it there yet today? Probably not. It's a guess, right? And it has to do with how many quantum computers are there? How available are they? But you know what? Someday they will be widely available. What will happen then?
Right.
And then we need to think about now, what would we do about it? And some of these plans are long-term. So thinking about it, building a strategy now, I think is quite important.
Quantum is definitely something that we'll be keeping our eye on. So let's talk about you and what you're up to these days to wrap things up here. You recently shifted your focus toward advisory and board roles. What drives the new career chapter, and what's one piece of advice you'd offer to someone just stepping into the world of cybersecurity leadership?
I love it. So a little personal side is I stepped down about a month ago for health reasons. I have some short-term health challenges I got to work through. Everything will be fine. It's just you can't be a CISO, which is a full-time job, and focus on getting through the health issues. You can't do both at the same time in this case. So I made the tough choice. It was a tough choice. Love my organization, love the team, amazing people, amazing organization. I have to focus on myself and solve those challenges. But they're short term. By short term, I mean, in 2026, I should be back to normal. And I found, and I've been on a couple of boards of directors. I've been on advisory boards. I really like that work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided, in a lot of formal training over the last 2 years in it, I'm going to dip my toe into that and see how that works. And shifting to your second question, for those pursuing a cybersecurity career, first thing, in my opinion, you picked a great career. You made the right choice. It's going to be a career that's going to exist for a long time. It's a job that's different every day. You get to use your brain, critical think, and it never gets old. I don't think anybody who's really in cybersecurity gets bored. And it's a great way to keep your brain active and ultimately to do good. If you do your cybersecurity job right, you're helping people. You're saving their information. You're saving their access to care, for example, if you're in healthcare, or access to money if you're in finance. You're doing good. So I highly recommend cybersecurity as a career.
So are you leaving the door open for potential future CISOing? Or you think you maybe have had enough of the adult size portion?
I've learned you never say no to a door that's open.
Ian, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. I think there are a lot of areas that we can dive into deeply with you here, and look forward to having you back on sometime in the near future.
It'd be a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, there you have it. Thanks for listening to Security Matters. If you like this episode, please follow us wherever you do your podcast thing so you can catch new episodes as they drop. And if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review. We'd appreciate it very much, and so will the algorithmic wins. What else? Drop us a line with questions, comments, and if you're a cybersecurity professional and you have an idea for an episode, drop us a line. Our email address is securitymatterspodcast, all one word, @cyberark.com. We hope to see you next time.